Hi there, welcome back to LeWeb, live from Paris, where we're just about to get underway with our second Google Plus Euronews Hangout of the day. And the guest now is Jeff Clavier, the founder of SofTech, the venture capital firm. He is listed as Forbes as one of the most active angel investors. We're going to be talking to him about investments, and particularly in the healthcare sector, as he's just emerged from a discussion on the future of healthcare on the main stage here at LeWeb. Joining us also are netizens. We have Antonio in Ireland.
Yes, I'm based in Cork, Ireland, just at the south of Ireland, in a city where we have Apple, EMC, VMware. So it's a very multicultural place.
And we have Michael, who is in Ukraine.
Yep. Hello from Kyiv.
So Jeff, now one of your a mantra of yours is that when you're looking for investment, is that you're looking for a smart-ass team building a kick-ass product
in a
big-ass market.
Yes.
Now
and we call that the 3 S's rule.
The 3 S's. Just how big-ass is the healthcare market?
Oh, it's gigantic. I won't say it's a gigantic ass. You know, the technical term I used on stage today, so I spent an hour and a half curating the healthcare session, is that for the US only, the spending in 2015 will be $4 trillion, which is $4,000 million. Mm-hmm. So it's really sort of a massive market, and any company that has even, you know, sort of a 1%, you know, improvement in terms of cost savings or efficiency or whatever can be really sort of a gigantic company.
Yeah. How does investing in healthcare differ from investing in leisure, in other sectors?
Well, I think the additional challenge that you have when you invest in healthcare is that there's always the regulatory aspect. So the FDA, Federal Drug Administration in the US, is extremely present in terms of, you know, as a watchdog, as a regulatory body, and anything you do in terms of claim, in terms of impact on someone's health, is carefully monitored, and therefore the cost of actually getting a company to stage 3. So, for example, in the US, developing a new drug takes about $1 billion, because it's going to take a number of you know, clinical trials, which are very lengthy, very costly, and so you try and, as you know, startups which are very agile, you try and stay away from the FDA as much as possible, which is why consumer healthcare is really where we've started investing the most, because this is where you're sort of free and clear of the FDA. And
does the US model provide more or fewer opportunities for investment than European healthcare model?
That's a great question, and you know, because so I was born in France. I'm a US citizen now, and my fund only focuses on the US market and US companies. So I haven't really sort of looked deeply into what it takes to build a startup very early stage in Europe. My understanding, though, is that the regulatory environment is actually simpler for startups. Certainly, it's simpler for devices, and you know, unfortunately, because of our focus, we'll go through the FDA and we'll sort of figure out what it means to go for the most, you know, stringent sort of market acceptance, assuming that once a company has reached a certain level of market maturity in the US, we can then expand into Europe.
Now, you've said that SofTech will be looking to invest in around 50 companies over the next
3 years.
3 years,
yeah, roughly.
How many of these do you think will be healthcare products, or is it just a pure case-by-case, merit-only, profit-only decision?
So it's a great question, and I actually can't really answer with a specific number, because what I can tell you is, so over the last year, we've made about 15 investments, and of those 15 investments, 3 were in the consumer healthcare space, right? So roughly 20% of the fund is, you know, in healthcare. However, we're pretty much you know, deal flow driven. So it's all about the inbound opportunities that come to us. Roughly, we're going to get 400 to 750 companies, you know, coming to us every quarter, and we're going to invest in 4 or 5. So, you know, 400 and change to 4 or 5. So there's a massive drop-off in the funnel. We're very keen on consumer healthcare. Right now, that's our sort of favorite sector. We've done both devices and services. And I have no doubt that we'll actually be investing in B2B healthcare, so services which are really tackling the needs of insurance or hospitals or doctors in the next few quarters.
Okay. Now, during the panel that you were just curating, you asked of Sean Duffy.
Yes.
What did you have to prove to investors to get finance? Turn the question around. What do firms looking for investment have to prove to you in specifically healthcare?
Sure.
sector?
So I think the challenge that we have with healthcare startups are both very similar to any sort of startup. So the 3 S's rule, we actually look at the founding team, the uniqueness of the product, and the market opportunity, and then we try and understand, okay, what is the regulatory environment? Are we close to the FDA? Do we have a risk or not? And what is the actual sort of user acquisition model? And is there sort of a prescription model where you need, doctors to actually go and recommend? In the case of Sean, he's working with a number of very large corporations to actually get the program sort of offered to their employees in order for them to onboard and so on and so forth. So it's really what are the levers of user acquisition, because those are the kinds of products which aren't viral per se. You're not gonna tweet about we talked about the microbiome on the panel. I don't see people sort of tweeting about their microbiome. So what are the vectors of user acquisition that we can use? And it's just not easy. It's a lot of marketing. It's convincing people this is legit. One of my companies was on the panel with me, Hello Neuroscience. It's a neurostimulation device. We'll have to prove to you through our marketing and our videos and our testimonials that this headband, A, doesn't fry your brain, and B, actually delivers on the promises. And so it's actually very tricky to build a successful early stage startup, and it's never cheap. So capital efficiency has been a common trait of a lot of our startups in this environment. It takes typically $1.5 to $2 million to get enough proof points on the table for series investors to come in and give you your next round. Healthcare startups are typically make it like double that, and you might be closer to the budget, so to speak.
Okay. So quantified results.
Quantified results or quantified insights. So as many data points as you can. And the trick is when you're like Daniel, where you have both to prove the science and to prove the device, doing both on a seed round is very tricky. So he's going to have to basically use his clinical, early trials as a proof point that this works, and then get to the next stage.
Let's go to Ireland. Antonio.
It was quite interesting because the portfolio that you are working with is basically on healthcare. So how do you see the startups that you are working with challenging the big players in the healthcare sector?
It's a great question, and I think there's really two things. Either you're going to create a market, or you're going to try and disrupt the market when it comes to healthcare. And as far as we're concerned, we're actually much more interested in market creation. So if you think about, let's say, Fitbit, which is the number one health tracking company in the world, 70% of the market in the US, which I seeded, about 6 years ago. So it's really about embracing the ecosystem and finding as many potential sort of distribution channels as possible. A more recent investment we've made called Lantern, which is a mobile-first access to mental coaching, which is sort of on-demand psychiatrist, or Uber for psychiatrists. This is actually not disrupting per se, it's complementing, where typically if you go see your shrink every week, you have one session of an hour in the calendar, and it's fixed. And let's say that you have a panic attack and you need some help, then you pull out your phone and you actually access a mental coach on demand. So I think that the opportunities to bring on-demand, real-time health, support is so big that I'm actually not worrying about, going against the big companies. It's more how can I leverage them as distribution. We'll see as the companies scale whether there is such a thing as competition.
Is there any truth in saying that the more that these mobile devices allow people to track their own health, that it relieves a certain amount of pressure on GPs, on doctors, and that would be an argument for governments to get involved in investing as well?
It's a great question, because there's two angles to this. One is a huge privacy issue. So let's say that I use Fitbit and for my scale and for my steps, and I sort of share that with my GP. What does that mean? How can he access my data in a privacy safe environment? And how can he make potential recommendations or decisions upon that data? And if someone makes at least in the US, someone makes a medical decision on data which has been shared, then this is data which has to be sort of HIPAA compliant and so on and so forth. So today, when you think about wellness, it's sort of the safe area that you could potentially print and fax, because that's the unfortunate sort of stage of communication. Very often you have to go to the lowest common denominator. It's printing something and faxing it to your GP because they don't have email, or if it's email, it's like very cumbersome. Over time, fast forward 5 years, I can see platforms that will allow you to give access to all this data to your GP, so they actually use all this real-time data that you're capturing on yourself to sort of either do monitoring or just check up on you every now and then and see when you go visit them what has been your exercise, your movements on weight and so on and so forth, so that they have a much better understanding and view of you, as opposed to just the snapshot that they have, which is, okay, at this very moment your blood pressure, your weight is XYZ.
Well, let's go east to Michael in Kiev.
Yeah, hello Jeff.
Hey Michael.
First, congratulations on your 10-year anniversary of your fund.
Oh, thank you so much.
Pretty good. I have a question about, actually two questions. First, US versus Europe in terms of number of startups in healthcare. We all know that US market probably much more mature than European in terms of healthcare. And do you see very big split in startups that apply you for investment from Europe and from US? And I leave another question for later.
Yeah. So I can show you one data point which I gathered when I was preparing for my panel, which is that over the last 4 quarters, US VCs have invested roughly $3 billion in healthcare startups, and 15% of those were outside of the US, so 85% was in the US. Not surprising, because those are sort of US numbers. I'm actually not super familiar with healthcare startups in Europe, because my fund focuses on the US, and we certainly have seen some competitors coming from Europe to our company. So Withings is a well-known company in France. It competes against Fitbit, but my impression is that we haven't seen in Europe the same kind of interest and really sort of increase in the number of both startup creations and funding, because it's obviously correlated, as we've seen in the US. I have no doubt that because it's a global opportunity, and there might actually be such a thing as a European solution, because privacy laws are different and because the regulatory environment is different. There might actually be 2 types of solutions. Like, HIPAA compliance is not something that exists in Europe, at least in that form. And so all the constraints related to the sharing of medical data just doesn't apply here. So unfortunately, I don't have much more than data point I shared, which is 85% of the companies that were funded by the VCs were in the US.
Michael, did you say you had a follow-up question to that?
Yep. Actually, I was interested about trends. Do you see any trends in terms of, let's say, insurance company would give some incentives for people who wear, let's say, Fitbit and share data with them, or like employer would pay higher salary or do something other to incentivize his workers, employees, to become more healthier and to be like to share this information with them. Do you see this trend, or it's future, not now?
So it's a great question, and I think the question isn't if, it's when, because when you Sean Duffy sort of shared with us the cost of having an employee who's type 2 diabetic is in the range of $16,000 for the employer. So in the US, because of the way sort of insurance companies sort of price their policies, and actually large companies insure themselves, there's a direct bottom line impact on the wellness of your employees. And so if you can actually incentivize someone to do more exercise by wearing a Fitbit, you will absolutely try and spend that money up front, because you know the $59 that it costs to buy someone Fitbit Zip, which is the entry level sort of product that we sell by tens of thousands to corporates, is actually it's insignificant compared to someone who's actually developing a disease like diabetes. And so we absolutely see employers incentivizing their teams by offering those devices, by putting in place challenges amongst teams as to which team, whether it's marketing or finance, that will work the most a given week. And eventually I can definitely see them sort of paying a portion of your health insurance, insurance premiums, because you've been actually, moving your ass. Yeah. As to whether they will give you pay you a higher salary, I don't see that coming. But in terms of what you end up paying for your healthcare premiums, yeah, there will definitely be an impact. And as you see studies that show that if you actually walk while working, you actually have the brain that is actually more efficient. You will start seeing all those workstations actually have workstation in the office. So I walk when I do my email, and supposedly that has a large benefit in terms of your ability to process information. So anything that you can give to your employees to make them healthier, reduces the number of sick days, reduces the cost of them being, sort of sick with something as dramatic as type 2 diabetes or something like that. So I think that there will be a trend in the next few years where they will be highly incentivizing their employees.
Can I interrupt just a second?
Sure.
So if let's say so a startup that will try to pursue something related with well-being, workplace, wearables, and gamification will be a startup that you would listen today.
Sure, and I would argue that Fitbit is that company. They've already delivered products in the marketplace, sold in the millions, that help monitor the activity, the sleep, and therefore sort of the well-being of employees. However, it's there are other factors that you might want to monitor. There are some companies, for example, that try to monitor the quality of the air in a room, and if ever the balance of CO2 increases or dust increases or whatever, that will sort of give you an alert that you actually have to open. I mean, those are sort of minor details, but they actually are important. So I can see sensors developing all over the place and sort of giving you some relevant sort of actions, notifications, and so on and so forth, so that you can improve the overall sort of well-being of the employees.
But before I've got a couple of questions on investment in general
Sure.
between US and Europe. But if there's anything that one of you guys wants to bring up on the subject of healthcare, then seize your chance. Okay, then I can move on to the. Now you're a Frenchman who's been living in the United States for 14, 15 years.
14 years, yeah. I'm actually a US citizen now.
In terms of risk taking, what's the difference between investing? Are investors likely to take more or bigger risks in the US than they are in France and in Europe?
Yeah, I think I have this quote which I think is unfair, but I'll share it. Is investors in Europe try and avoid losing money, investors in the US try and make money, and therefore their appetite for risk is much higher. There will be a number of my friends who are VCs in Europe who will say it's BS, it's not true. We are approaching risk the same way, and that's true. The problem is, it's the top of the market which is like that. It's not the core of the market. Whereas the core of the market in the US is very much prone to risk taking, and so the appetite for things which are not proven, like Elon Musk is one of the most celebrated entrepreneurs of this day and age, rightly so, because the problems he's trying to tackle are just massive, sending people to Mars, putting rockets up there in space, and the funds that actually backed him to the tune of several $100 million are completely crazy, except they worked. Right? And so I think that this notion of extremely binary outcomes where, you'll put, in the case of Peter Thiel, $100 million in SpaceX. And I can tell you that I know some of his LPs that were really furious about having so much of the fund put in a rocket, space company, except that he will pay handsomely and they will make billions of dollars on that one. So Peter Thiel is an exception, is very gifted. It is, repeatedly been backing, companies like Facebook, SpaceX, and so on and so forth. But I think that it's a model that we have where we know that when we invest, 30% of the companies that we back will blow up. Right. And that's completely fine. That's what we do. And, some people who tell me, oh, I've only lost, one company out of 10, I will just turn around and say, you're just not taking enough risk.
So do you think that what we need before a European tech giant is to emerge, does it come more from the investors, or does it come from regulation in Europe? No,
I think it's really, I have no doubt. Look, Skype was a really big outcome, very big success. I think that it's kind of a overall challenge, which is the culture of risk has to be sort of the same, where people have to be like the problem in the US, or at least in Silicon Valley, there's almost failure porn, where it's good to fail, it's celebrated to fail a bit, almost too much. So accepting failure, embracing failure, and not having the cultural, social consequences of failure. And I think there is a lot of progress being made on that. 25 years ago, when I told my father I wasn't going to work for a big company, I was going to go do a startup, he said, I don't understand, you've always had good grades. I was like, what? That? Because at the time, if you had good grades, you went through the best schools, and then you end up, taking a job in a big company. Yeah. And that has changed, thank God. Then you have, the availability of capital, so VCs can actually raise their funds more easily. That's the challenge. They're really afraid of losing, some of their investment because it's so hard for them to raise, funds. We certainly have in the US way more capital available to raise financing from. And then there's the ambition of the entrepreneurs, which is, well, if I'm a French or UK or German entrepreneur, what's my outcome potential? Well, I look at the companies that might be an acquirer for me, and either I can become global and then I have a shot at getting acquired by Facebook, Google, Yahoo, and so on and so forth, or I look at the local market and then the potential sort of exit outcome, size, dollars are very sort of limited. And that's sort of the constraint. So we need to sort of figure out how to unlock that by having entrepreneurs who have the goal to build global companies. And to be honest, you can build a global European company and go for something which is worth multi-billion dollars without ever touching the US market, right? So it's not always a question of I have to go global, break out of Europe and go to the US or Asia, but at least it's having the ambition, the hunger, the drive to build something really, really big.
Yeah. Well, a good case in point would be the last guest we had up here, Nicolas Brusson,
Yep.
who hasn't tried to penetrate the US market, but who did something which was perhaps a little bit un-European by expanding before he'd even mastered the market in France.
And that's great. And BlaBlaCar is a great example of a fantastic startup that has raised a lot of capital. You know, not that many US startups, you know, in broad numbers raise, you know, $100 million round, right? The air becomes rarefied there, right? Yeah. And so what they've done is awesome. And Nicole actually and I had a chat last night about this. And the US is actually not a great market for BlaBlaCar because we tend to, you know, like the rides would be too short in the US for BlaBlaCar to really sort of make enough money, or if those rides are longer, people fly, right? Because we have this sort of weird public transportation sort of system where, you know, we don't really have trains, we just have, you know, sort of airplanes and a huge network of airports. So I think that we can safely say that BlaBlaCar can build a multi-billion-dollar company by just focusing on Europe or the countries where, you know, the transportation model actually applies. And maybe it's a case that Asia is actually good for them. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, listen, before we go, I'd like to go back to Antonio and to Michael for any last questions.
Okay, you were mentioning Europe and in US, and at the moment we have the European agenda for 2020, and will you see that, you know, if you are a very ambitious European startup of a group of people, would you stay here and go to all that bureaucratic European system through startups and phases, or you just pack and go and pitch to New York or San Francisco?
Well, you know, I've made my personal choice. So I'm a U.S. citizen. I'm based in Palo Alto. We sort of left Europe 14 years ago on a one-way ticket without ever intending to return. So I think I'm the wrong person to ask that question because, you know, I've had that question from, you know, François Hollande came to the States this year and he asked me that question. And I basically explained that, look, the probability that a Frenchman would become one of the main investors at a given stage in Silicon Valley was basically zero, except that I tried and it worked. And so when you're me and you're in the center of the Valley's ecosystem on the funding side, you don't move, you don't get out, you don't go away anywhere because this vibrancy, I mean, only exists today in China, and you have to have a deep knowledge of the Chinese market not to lose, you know, all your investments. So I'm just staying put where I am because of what I've accomplished over the last 10 years. But I do think that there are opportunities in Europe, and I see, you know, not 10, 50, 100 new micro VCs developing, but, you know, over the last 6 months, I've seen 2 of my friends breaking away from their VC firms to build new firms with new approaches, which are geared towards building, you know, high velocity sort of global companies from London or from Paris. And I've been trying to give them feedback and help them on how to set up and look at things the way we look at them, as opposed to sort of the maybe more traditional sort of European way. And so I have no doubt that there are opportunities. The problem is, you know, I feel that there is some kind of a competition between London and Paris and Berlin as to which one is the best hotbed for startups in Europe. And I think, well, I can understand the challenge. I think it's bad for Europe. in general, because there's no value in having sort of London and that's it, or Paris and that's it, or London that's it. And I read a quote from Axel Lemaire today that said that France doesn't have anything to learn from Silicon Valley, and I found that a very, very questionable sort of quote.
Yeah. Almost frightening from someone from Silicon
Well,
Valley.
I had a discussion with her 2 days ago, and I didn't feel like, I mean, sort of tried to say that one of the challenges I see with French tech is, it's great to try and foster innovation around France, because there are certainly a bunch of great engineering schools in France, and I'm a product of that, so I know. But the issue with startups is, if you don't learn about building a startup, being a CEO, being a chief marketing officer, being a CTO on TechCrunch or in a book. You learn it by doing it at another startup and then doing your own, or you learn it by having people who've done it before, close to you, mentoring you. And the problem is that around France, I just don't see that happening. And so I'd rather sort of see a very strong cluster in Paris around the incubators and the schools and so on and so forth. And it's coming. It's coming. There's no doubt in my mind it's going to be coming. The problem is that it's going to take 5 to 10 years, because it took 40 years to build Silicon Valley to the state it is today. And the problem is, in the political world, there's always sort of the next election is in 3 years or in 5 years or whatever. I need to deliver, a tangible result which will make me reelected by then. And we're not talking about that phase. It's going to take years. And so trying to do too much means lack of focus. And I think, we learned a thing or two building Silicon Valley.
Yeah. Well, let's go outside of Europe in European Union terms. The perspective from the fringes, the eastern fringes, from Ukraine, Michael.
It was interesting to ask you about whether you see some kind of limitations in terms of investments. Probably healthcare industry is more money intensive, and when you invest in early stage startup, maybe sometimes you can miss some kind of breakthrough technology because it's just require more money just to proof of concept. Like a great example, Elon Musk. I mean, he had to take government loan actually to prove that his concept works, and your fund invests about 750,000 in every startup. So what if idea is actually that's breaking through, maybe tomorrow's technology for everybody, require more money, let's say 5 million just to prove that concept is worth to think about. Do you see these limitations in terms of your strategy of investments?
That's Michael. That's a great point, and yes is the answer. So the challenge we have as seed investors is we're going to invest, call it $2 million, sometimes 3, can stretch to 4 million, in a company that is going to have about 1.5 to 2 years to prove itself. That is a very, very short time, especially for fundamental technology. And one of my companies recently in the healthcare space is Six Sensor Labs. It's a food allergen test device. So it's basically a mix of chemical engineering, because they've developed this antibody that fixes proteins that are so lactose or gluten or peanuts, and you need to sort of take a bit of food, put it in that vial, and get the chemical compound to start activating, and then put it in the device, which is going to shake it, and then within 2 minutes, it will tell you whether one of the food allergens you have, is present in the food. That is horrendously complex. There are mechanical engineering issues, there are chemical engineering issues, there are, sort of design issues or whatever. And this company, raised already $4 million, which is a very large seed round. And, the clock is ticking. They have a very short time to prove themselves. And, if I think about some sort of fundamental breakthrough technology in artificial intelligence, in energy, batteries or whatever, those might actually need 4 to 5 years to actually develop and get to fruition. And in that case, you have two choices. One is actually convince traditional VCs that this is so fundamental that you will have to raise 30 million from the get-go, in which case you won't come to me because my fund is too small for that, or you will go for, you know, a much longer challenging sort of road, which is getting, you know, university grants or research grants from the government, or you will try and appeal to foundations, because essentially the challenge we have, as Michael sort of pointed out, is we have a set budget and a set time to prove ourselves. And the worst for us, you know, there are two types of startups. One where you're too early, and the ones where you're way too early. And if you're way too early, basically you lose your cash. You want to sort of try and time the market such there is something once you've gone through your seed funding. So seed financing has really enabled a lot of new industries and a lot of new companies, but the concept can't be applied to each and every sector, unfortunately. Like, you would never seed fund a drug, because it takes $1 billion to go through the whole, regulatory process for a new drug.
Well, listen, we're out of time, but it's been really interesting talking to you, and thanks very much
My pleasure.
for your time. Thank you also to Antonio and to Michael for your time as well. I hope
Thank
to
you,
see
guys.
you
Great questions.
the next Google Euronews Hangouts at 4 o'clock with Tai Chris, the CEO of On-Off Telecom, but he's a man who's got his finger in quite a few pies, including extreme sports, and we're going to be talking to him about that at 4 o'clock Central European time. So see you then. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you.